great pleasure for me because Kobena Mercer is a great friend of mine and the one who got away in the recruitment process and ended up at Yale, not at Harvard, but he's very many years ago. But an old and dear friend, and I had the pleasure of collaborating with Kobena on the editing and publishing of Stuart Hall's Du Bois lectures from 1994 about, and Stuart was a good friend, would never let me publish them. I begged him. Often I would go to, what's the name of it? Ulysses. Was it Ulysses' place, right?
Right.
And I would go to their house. They had fabulous art. We would eat, we would drink. I'd take them to get Indian food. I'd get them liquored up. You want me to do that all over again? I'd get him liquored up and I'd say, Stuart, you're going to let us publish those lectures. These were the Du Bois lectures, published by Harvard University Press. And he'd say, Next day, like, what? I never said that. Unfortunately, he passed. And fortunately, his widow, Dr. Catherine Hall, agreed with one condition. Well, two, actually. But the first was that Kobena would edit the lectures. And then second, to my enormous surprise and astonishment, really, but great pleasure, if I were to write the foreword. And we published that as The Fateful Triangle. And it has Stuart's wonderful essay about racist floating signifier, for which, among other things, will always be remembered. But it was published, when was it published? In the fall?
Yeah, fall last year.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful book, so I hope you all will get a copy. This lecture series is endowed by one of my best friends, Richard Cohen. And Richard Cohen's from Boston, went to BU, a great collector of art, connoisseur of art, and very best friends with Frank Gehry. And he and Frank own a 74-foot sailboat, which Richard paid for, but Frank designed. And you should Google Frank Gehry's sailboat. They took it to Havana, and I was part of just blessed to be asked to be part of this party. The good news is that we did not sail from Key West, like in To Heaven, to Have Not. You know, you read To Heaven, to Have Not, you think it's just like a little ride in a motorboat. It is like a nightmare of waves. It made me really understand how courageous the boat people who fled Cuba and ended up in the United States really were, because it's really rough water. And so what Richard did was fly us down in his plane with Frank to Havana. We went to Marina Hemingway, got on the boat, and then spent 2 hours in rain and rough waters sailing into Havana with the CNN crew waiting for us and all that. It was really one of the great events of my life. Richard is the vice chair of the Hutchins Center. I met him through Glenn Hutchins, for whom the Hutchins Center is named, of course. And he's been a very generous donor. And the first work of art that he gave us when my Yale friend, Bert Cooper, agreed to fund what is now the Cooper Gallery was Yinka Shonabare's, one of his amazing pieces for a lot of money. And that it was the beginning of our permanent collection at the Cooper Gallery. And all those sort of circles, the fact that he bought, you know, a Nigerian person from London, a work of art from a guy who lives in London, just underscored the connections of the black world, the black Atlantic, and the black arts movement, or black cultural studies movement under Stuart's unofficial tutelage. Stuart didn't believe in movements. He didn't want to be the leader of anything, but he was, and he did create a movement. And he had very loyal devotees, acolytes, Paul Gilroy, Isaac Julian, and none more dear to his heart than my friend Kobena Mercer. So I went to Richard and I said, we have 3 lecture series, the Du Bois lectures, which I inherited, and the Alain Locke lectures, and the Stuart McMillan lectures on African studies. And Alain Locke, of course, is a great literary critic and art critic. So broadly under the humanities and the arts, we could bring people like Kobena in to lecture. But I wanted something specific to art. You might wonder why art was so central, art history and the practice of art, to the vision that Anthony Appia and I had in 1991. We came here, and there was nobody here but Werner Solers. And it's because of my undergraduate education at Yale. And at Yale, Afro-American studies the Afro-American Studies program was started in 1969, the year I went to Yale. And the largest course that was taught, sponsored by the department, was by Robert Ferris Thompson. So I've known Robert Thompson since I was 19 years old. And he was my professor when I went off to the University of Cambridge. And to my astonishment, I didn't even know who Wole Soyinka was, but basically Wole Soyinka was there, and I discovered who he was, and I became his only student. And I said to him, you know, I don't know anything about Yoruba culture. I've been all over Africa, and I had been by that time. But I didn't know anything about Yoruba culture and mythology. And I said, could you give me a primer, you know, an introduction? He said, yeah. He took a book off the shelf. It was Black Gods and Kings by this white man, Robert Ferris Thompson from El Paso, Texas. How about that? So I wanted, kind of as a tribute to Robert Thompson, and a tribute to an acknowledgement of the presence of the study of African and African-American art in the broader field of African-American studies, based on the Yale model. I wanted that lecture series endowed specifically for scholars of African and African-American art. And also, by the way, if you want to know, I mean, we are what we're taught. Our whole diasporic focus, which you see manifested, you know, brilliantly in the Department of African-American Studies upstairs under the leadership of my dear friend Lawrence Douglas Bobo, that all came from Yale. Bob Thompson used to lecture with 3 slide projectors. And he would show repeating motifs, one from African art, one from Afro-Latin American art, and one from continental African-American art. That's how I was raised, intellectually, to conceptualize. Nobody said this is how you conceptualize the field. It was just demonstrated. The first chair of Afro-American Studies at Yale was a black man from Panama. I came from Piedmont, West Virginia. I didn't even know Panama had black people. You know, I grew up with 300 black people in an Irish-Italian paper mill town. I did not know about the diaspora. But it was spoon-fed to me. It was, no, better metaphors, by osmosis. The idea of a tri-continental approach to black studies, broadly construed. That's what I was introduced to. And that's what Anthony and I tried to do, and that's what my colleagues here under Evelyn Higginbotham and then Larry Bobo have instituted and exemplified. And this lecture series, having a black man of Jamaican, Anglo-Jamaican heritage, who lives in London, who was tutored by Stuart Hall one way or another, come to talk about Alain Locke's take on African art. There, that says it right there. And so I'm very, very happy to have Kobena here and to turn the microphone over to my friend Carrie. Thank you.
Which I do at this one. That was like the quintessential Skip Gates introduction. I have no storms in Key West or yachts or Nobel Prize winning novelists or anything like that to start off here. But that's okay, because I think what we want to do is move on to our lectures today. We're so lucky to have Kobena Mercer here for a series of lectures. There'll be 3 that at the same time and same place for the next 3 days. So we're really going to get a chance to think deeply with him about Alain Locke and the questions about art that are on his mind right now. One of the things that I value Professor Mercer's work for most is the sort of subtlety and clarity of the way that he thinks. And what always stands out to me, one of my actually favorite moments in not just your work, but in art history, is the moment in I think it's a 1991 essay on photography and looking at Robert Mapplethorpe, where he does something I had never, when I read this for the first time, ever seen an academic do, which is to change his mind. he, in that essay, revises an opinion that he expressed a few years earlier in another perfectly brilliant and important essay. What was so stunning to me is that it was only that essay then becomes this wonderful meditation on ambivalence and the importance of ambivalence for thinking identity and intersectionality as we think about and look at art in terms of the multiple positions that we all occupy relative to it. So I just want to say thank you. As you've heard, Kobena Mercer is one of the leading art historians and scholars and critics of our time. He is currently professor of history of art and African American studies at Yale, where he teaches art from the African diaspora, African American, Caribbean, and Black British art, bringing critical methods from cultural studies to the way that he thinks and talks about modern and contemporary Black art. Before being at Yale, he taught at NYU and the University of California, Santa Cruz, and Goldsmiths College at the University of London. He was educated in Ghana and England and has his PhD in sociology from Goldsmiths College. He's had, I'll try to keep it short, all the big fellowships that one can have, including having been the inaugural recipient of the Clark Prize for Excellence in Arts Writing, awarded by the Sterling and Francine Clark Art Institute in 2006. To give you just a quick sense of the arc of his work, his book, Welcome to the Jungle, New Positions in Black Cultural Studies in 1994 was a major contribution to the field. And I would add that the way that he brings cultural studies to art history has been, and into our kind of conversations, has been very important for my field. His studies on Romare Bearden, Keith Piper, Isaac Julian, and James Van Der Zee followed. And most recently, his book, Travel and See, Black Diaspora Art Practices Since the 1980s, looks at artists such as John Akomfra, Renee Green, Isaac Julian, Carrie James Marshall, and others in the period from 1992 to 2012. I'm going to let him take the stage. So please join me in welcoming Professor Kobena Mercer.
Thank you. And I said Jamaica, I should have said Ghana. So.
Well, I'm a diasporic subject, so I think both. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really honored to be invited to present these lectures. Even though coming back to the Barker Center is comfortably familiar. So I was here in 2009, but also with the workshop we had for Image of the Black in Western Art that David Byman, who co-edited the series with Skip, organized. That was 2012. So it's both an honor, but also a pleasure to be back here again in this very comfortable wood-paneled room. And just to thank Carrie and Skip for their introductions, and also to say, I just want to acknowledge how deeply gratifying it's been to be welcomed so warmly into African American Studies departments, whether that was UC Santa Cruz, whether my time at NYU, at Yale, or here. I feel that it's an absolute confirmation of that tri-continental diasporic experience, which is very much a living reality. When I was 18-year-old, I couldn't have foreseen that 40 years later, this would be my milieu, my environment. So I'm deeply appreciative to everyone who's made that possible. Skip, if I could encourage you to take one of these seats, because I'm going to be showing some slides. Okay. So I'll just get started. Okay. So we see the printmaker, James Lesesne Wells, holding a ceremonial cup created by the Congolese Bakuba people. But the photographer Jules Latimer Allen takes us far beyond mere portraiture. The care he took in composing the image speaks to a question that's central to the beginnings of African American modernism at large. What's the relationship between African art and African American artists? So we see two faces brought together on a diagonal axis, with the geometric pattern on the base of the anthropomorphic cup. If I can get the laser pointer. We can see that repeated in the kind of diamond shape of Wells's glossy necktie. Yet even as the image evokes a relationship of mirroring, the asymmetry of the diagonal preempts any facile equivalence between African artifact and African American artist. So our attention concentrates on Wells's inward realm of thought as his downward gaze, wholly absorbed in the act of beholding, underlines an introspective attitude that's further stressed by the radiant glow illuminating his forehead. So the Bakuba vessel serves to, quote, convey a symbolic relationship between the object and the artist, as one African art scholar puts it. But do we agree that this is because of the, quote, empowering nature of Alain's photographs? Is it a scene of empowerment that we're witnessing, or is it a scene of self-questioning? With an inquiring expression on his face, Wells has tactile intimacy with an object that's held close to his body, even though he's holding it at one remove so as to be able to see the wooden carving as a whole. But instead of empowerment, what I see in that inquiring look is a question echoing the one County Cullen asked in his 1925 poem Heritage: what is Africa to me? Harlem Renaissance studies tend to assume that the encounter between African American artists and African objets d'art was automatically affirmative, that black subjects found instant self-confirmation in the Dan masks, the fan reliquary figures, or the Bakuba items they saw in museums and photographs. On closer inspection, however, African American art of the 20s and 30s that engaged with African materials rarely gives us a straightforward affirmation of identity. For what we see in the art of diasporic ancestralism is modernist self-questioning that addresses the conditions under which subjectivity and identity are constituted in cultural relations of identification. So I want to start by asking whether the problem with which I began, the problem of not seeing what the artwork is actually showing us, holds true for our received understanding of Locke's writings on the visual arts as well. His 1925 essay, The Legacy of the Ancestral Arts, is foundational to African American art historiography. Yet to hear it paraphrased as saying that behind it all was, quote, the idea that there was an unbroken stream of culture from Africa to the Americas, end quote, is to find not just a misreading, but a non-reading that suggests we may not have been paying as close attention as we should. Locke could not have been clearer in his opening paragraphs that the reason why, quote, the emotional temper of the American Negro is exactly opposite, end quote, that of the African, was because of the rude transplanting of slavery. Where, quote, characteristic African art expressions are rigid, controlled, disciplined, abstract, heavily conventionalized, those of the African American, Locke writes, are free, exuberant, emotional, sentimental, and human, end quote. And it's the discontinuity caused by the middle passage that, in his view, explains why, quote, music and poetry, and to an extent the dance, have been the predominant arts of the American Negro, end quote. For the enslaved carried speech, music, and dance in their bodies and souls, while the material culture of architecture and art was left behind in, quote, African cultures where plastic and craft arts predominate. So starting with this reversal of emotional temper in the 1925 essay is all important because Locke argues that cultural traits of, quote, exuberance and improvising spontaneity that have been historically attributed to the American Negro, quote, represent the workings of environmental factors rather than the outcropping of a race psychology, end quote. So since such traits are acquired rather than innate, black artists are not automatically destined to feel any affinity with African art. But, and this is the gist of his argument, they have much to gain from a learning relationship that looks two ways. Locke was urging artists of the 1920s to take a double-facing stance of looking back to the ancestral past while also looking across the Atlantic to absorb lessons from European artists, and then to hyphenate both in order to create a modernism that would be distinctively African American. So when it's mistakenly assumed that Locke was advocating a reclaim your roots approach, we drastically oversimplify the analytical attention to cross-cultural traffic among Africa, Europe, and America that is front and center to Locke's visual arts writings. This threefold relationship of cross-cultural interaction also underpins his 1930s articles on the contributions of Negro folk culture to American national culture. And Locke's interactive approach to the visual arts culminates in The Negro in Art, his 1940 art book that put representations of blacks in Western art history into dialogue with black self-representations in 20th century art. And there's more than this. The key idea of contact in Locke's thinking about cross-cultural relationships was put forward in his 1916 Howard University lectures on race contacts and interracial relations, which led to the view that all civilizations are composite formations that grow as a result of contact between different cultures. And all of this brought Locke to conclude, as he expressed most eloquently in his 1942 essay, one of my favorite titles, Who or What is Negro? To conclude that, quote, to be Negro in the cultural sense then is not to be radically different, but to be distinctively composite, end quote. In this essay, he says, if neither national nor racial cultural elements are so distinctive as to be mutually exclusive, then it is the general composite character of culture which is disregarded by such oversimplifications. And he continued, strictly speaking, we should cite this composite character in our culture with hyphenated descriptions, but more practically, we stress the dominant flavor of the blend. It's only in this same limited sense that anything is legitimately styled Negro. Actually, it is Afro or Negro American, a hybrid product of Negro reaction to American cultural forms and practice. So with his emphasis on hybridity and the interactive hyphenation of identities, Locke reaches forward from his era to ours with a relational outlook that seems to anticipate the cultural studies model in which culture is examined as a composite text made up of multiple signifying elements. But rather than hastily label him as a proto-constructionist or anti-essentialist, which risks, I think, dehistoricizing Locke's thought in the name of a presentism that overlooks the discontinuities between his time and our own, I want to reframe matters by foregrounding Locke's philosophical training in pragmatism. Although he's mostly characterized as an aesthetician devoted to beauty in the seven arts, when we think of Locke instead as a public intellectual who put his pragmatist training in service to the cultural recomposition of African American blackness that was emerging in the 1920s, we not only arrive at a fresh vantage from which to understand the unity of theory and practice in his life's work, but also Locke's contemporary relevance leaps into view in new ways too. So introducing his survey graphic number of 1925, Locke revealed that the new in New Negro was never a neutral temporal adjective, but rather it was the marker of a transformation brought about by the convergence of disparate black identities under modern urban conditions. Quote, our Harlems are crucibles, he wrote. This is the metaphorical Mecca, bringing black lives from all over the world into one specific place, Harlem. And he continued, Harlem attracted the African, the West Indian, the American Negro, has brought together the Negro of the North and the Negro of the South, the man from the city and the man from the town and the village, the peasant, student, businessman, professional man, artist, poet, musician, adventurer and worker, preacher and criminal, exploiter and social outcast, end quote. So what makes Negro new is not a before and after narrative in which modern black identities simply arise ex nihilo, out of nothing, but the concentration of composite elements under urban conditions in this crucible-like medium of culture, which is what makes new forms of contact possible. So on this view, the emergence of newness in 20th century art, i.e. modernism, has less to do with individual expressions of innate originality and more to do with the frisson of cross-cultural difference that arises from contact in the urban spaces of modern life. As scholars have long agreed, modernism itself was born from cross-cultural contact among European artists and African artifacts at the turn of the century. And were we to place Alain's sepia-toned portrait, with which I began, of James Lecesne Wells, on a continuum with the Henri Matisse still life showing the Vili carving of Congolese origin that Matisse purchased in 1905 en route to one of Leo and Gertrude Stein's Sunday evening salons. And this was a carving that Pablo Picasso held in his hands all evening, according to the writer Max Jacob. It would be entirely logical to put these two works on a continuum, since it was the enigmatic opacity of the culturally alien objects that attracted the interests of artists, whether the artists were French, Spanish, or African American. But no such continuum exists in the scholarship, and that's because art history compartmentalizes the study of primitivism in European modernism into a space that separates it from the study of ancestralism in African American modernism and Afro-Modernism more broadly. So the relevance of Locke's thinking is that his conceptualization of cross-cultural interaction enables us to decompartmentalize the common ground that's historically shared by artists of different ethnicities. And all the better to examine what Mikhail Bakhtin would call the critical dialogism, whereby black and white artists took their mutual interest in African art into entirely different semantic directions. So in Gordon Parks's fantastic 1940 portrait, we see Locke looking. He's immersed in the act of looking, gazing at a bust of the dancer Harold Kreutzberg by the sculptor Richmond Barthé. And the upraised diagonal in Parks's photograph reveals Locke's attentiveness, whereas Matisse's mode of looking in the still life seemed to relate to the strange objet d'art, primarily as a thing, an object amongst objects. But on the other hand, it's as if Locke is beholding not an object, but another subject. Art, it's important to bear in mind, was never prominent in Locke's education. With his first degree from Philadelphia School of Pedagogy, he studied English and philosophy at Harvard from 1904 to 1907, graduating magna cum laude age 22. Locke's distinction as the first African American to win the Rhodes Scholarship instantly became the stuff of legend, although less frequently remarked is that after 2 years at University of Oxford, from 1907 to 1909, his thesis wasn't accepted. Much time was spent socializing with fellow members of the Cosmopolitan Club at Oxford, and at every vacation, Locke traveled abroad, touring Europe's cathedrals and museums, often in the company of his mother, Mary Locke. So while Locke paid for a year's study at the University of Berlin in 1910-11 and subsequently reworked his rejected Oxford thesis into the dissertation that he submitted to Harvard in 1917, for which he was awarded his PhD, the dilemma he faced when he first returned to America in 1912, as perhaps, this is Charles Molesworth, one of his biographers, perhaps the most deeply and exquisitely educated African Americans of his generation. The dilemma he faced was not solely due to the entrenched nature of American segregation. Despite a handful of essays in journals such as the North American Review, Locke had not really found his métier at the time that he took up an assistant professorship at the Teachers College of Howard University, where he became a full professor in philosophy in 1916, when the university was reorganized as a liberal arts education. He was, by many accounts, something of a dilettante. But when Jean Toomer, County Cullen, and other writers sought him out to critically assess their poetry and prose in the 1920s, Locke's transformation into an engaged cultural critic owed much to his galvanizing encounter with African art. As Locke became aware of an emergent black literary movement, and Charles S. Johnson, the editor of Opportunity, gave him a platform to publish reviews, Locke's encounter with African art was a catalyst in his transformation into a public figure. Since Locke wrote as a generalist for whom cultural criticism would shake up conventional attitudes around race, understanding exactly how he came to write The Legacy of the Ancestral Arts is quite instructive. and how we came to write about African art more broadly. So without a specialist background in art history, Locke came to the visual arts as an aesthete, undoubtedly. But with his interactive approach to cross-cultural contact, what fascinated him about the uptake of tribal artifacts in French modernism was a scene of cultural traffic that completely undermined imperial hierarchies of superiority and inferiority. For in Paris, circa 1905, sophisticates of the European avant-garde were now students learning from ancient African tradition. So his very first article on art in the May 1924 issue of Opportunity, a themed issue on African art that Locke ghost edited on Johnson's behalf, he argued the point not just in the text alone, but also in the very layout on the printed page, with a Zui Muya carving dated to the 13th century taking precedence on the left-hand side over the Modigliani head from 1915 on the facing page. So it's not just in the article, in the argumentation, but in the very layout of the article, he's underscoring the point that ancient Africa was now the tutor to European moderns. However, it's crucial for us to grasp that this was never a simple binary reversal of the imperial relationship in which the non-West had to learn from the West. For a year later, in 1925, in The Legacy of the Ancestral Arts, the reason why Locke urged emerging new Negro artists to take notice of European modernism was because he wanted them to overcome what he saw as their, quote, timid conventionalism. As the timid conventionalism whereby 19th century black artists who shied away from black subject matter and who aspired to the verisimilitude of academicism betrayed, in his view, a mindset in which, quote, American Negro artists have too long shared the conventional blindness of the Caucasian eye, end quote, unable to see the beauty in black. But we need to back up a little bit. Locke gave the visual as much emphasis in his 1925 survey graphic as the literary, where the new Negro's newness was foregrounded by the new Sachlichkeit portraits of so-called Harlem types by the German expatriate Weinhold Reiss, who had also previously illustrated the survey graphic on the Mexican Revolution. Yet even before this, Locke's role in Opportunity's May 1924 issue indicated the way his cultural criticism turned modernist discourse on African art toward Afro-diasporic directions. Indeed, the very genesis of the 1925 essay reveals the pragmatism of intellectual interventions that were not limited to the analytical thinking or the aesthetic judgment of his articles, but which extended also to exhibition curating and collection building, activities that highlight the world-making that was the driver in Locke's overall philosophy of culture. So we've had a look at the double-page spread here on pages 136 and 137, preceding articles by the art collector Albert Barnes and the gallerist Paul Guillaume. And as we turn to subsequent pages in Opportunity's May 1924 issue, we see how Locke's interventions really serve as a diagram for the entangled social relations under which the Afro-Modernist paradigm of ancestralism came into being. So in December of 1923, Locke was in Paris en vacances. He was sought out by Albert Barnes, the idiosyncratic pharmaceutical millionaire, who was building a museum just outside Philadelphia to house his collection. And Locke agreed to look over Barnes's article on African art, which was published the following year by Ex Libris, the American Library in Paris. And Barnes had hoped the article might be reprinted in the US as well. So although in January of 1924, Barnes wrote Howard University saying, quote, "Last month, I had the pleasure of meeting in Paris your professor of philosophy and psychology, but I've lost his name," end quote. Despite that, Locke encouraged Johnson to invite Barnes, who was a potential patron, a potential ally of the New Negro movement, to the 21st March Civic Club dinner that ostensibly sought to launch Jessie Fawcett's novel, but which launched the Harlem Renaissance more broadly by bringing black writers together with white decision makers such as the publisher Albert Boney, gatekeepers such as Century magazine editor Carl Van Doren, and tastemakers such as the Vanity Fair writer Carl van Vechten. So Albert Barnes then was significant as a potential ally, so much so that on the following Tuesday, 24th of March, Locke wrote back to him to thank him for the visit that he and Charles Johnson had travelled to Merion to look at Barnes's collection of modern and African art. And indeed, Locke and Johnson visited the Barnes Foundation again in April and May of 1924. So a year later, a version of Barnes's essay did indeed appear in the survey graphic number, but as Locke sought to expand its contents for the anthology that was published by Boney and Liverlight in December of 1925, he wrote to Van Vechten in May of 1924, asking him to write about black visual arts, indicating that he, quote, imperatively needed something more suggestive and concrete than Dr. Barnes's kindly but vague assertions, end quote. And it was when Van Vechten declined, citing Vanity Fair deadlines, that Locke ended up writing The Legacy of the Ancestral Arts. So Barnes extolled Guillaume's Rue La Boétie gallery as the temple, and gave this title to his article in Opportunity, a place where, as Barnes wrote, quote, worshippers of all nationality flow into that temple because of what it offers in spiritual nourishment, end quote. Praising African art with nebulous platitudes, Barnes's lack of scholarly training revealed his undifferentiated idea of the Negro to be incapable of those comparative distinctions between African, European, and African American traditions that were central to Locke's thinking right from the very beginning. So, for all his negrophilia, Barnes was an irascible eccentric whose foundation was mired in contradiction. His racially integrated workforce started each day with a 2-hour seminar, including readings of Freud. But while Barnes's foundation was built on a reform-minded effort to make art democratically accessible, admission to the museum at Merion was by invitation only. Photographic reproduction would seem to be the most straightforward way of making his modern art collection publicly accessible, yet the Barnes Foundation forbade photo reproductions of the Renoirs, Cézannes, Matisses in his collection on the grounds that ersatz copies rendered aesthetic experience inauthentic. And indeed, when Matisse requested a slide in the 1950s, long after Barnes had died, he was refused. So the policy was enforced. But an exception, or was it a double standard perhaps, was made for African art, because Barnes allowed Charles Sheeler to produce postcards, leading Sheeler, the precisionist painter, to specialize in photographing tribal carvings owned by New York collectors of African art, such as John Quinn and Louise and Walter Arsenberg. And Sheeler's images are to be found in the Barnes Foundation's 1927 art book, Primitive Negro Sculpture. And it is, of course, Sheeler's photographs that we see both in Opportunity and in Survey Graphic, as well as the Boney and Liverlight anthology. So despite his many foibles, however, Barnes was an institutional player in the American reception of African art. But then again, so was Locke, and this is important if we want to decompartmentalize the study of primitivism and ancestralism. And I say this because when we conventionally focus on the legacy of the ancestral arts, we tend to overlook Locke's equally important activities as a curator, and I'll talk about the 1927 exhibition in a moment, and also as an institution builder, and I'll be talking about the Harlem Museum of African Art, the concept that he put forward. So one of the key insights in the Met's 2012 exhibition, African Art, New York and the Avant-Garde, was to periodize the US reception of African art. And this was with the first phase marked by the exhibition Statuary in Wood by African Savages that was held at Alfred Stieglitz's 291 Gallery on Fifth Avenue. So that took place in 1914. And the principal lender for this was Guillaume. The second phase being marked by two 1923 exhibitions, recent paintings by Pablo Picasso and Negro sculptures that was held at Whitney Studio Club. And then at Brooklyn Museum, there was also in 1923 primitive Negro art, chiefly from the Belgian Congo, curated by Stuart Cullen, who was the head of the museum's ethnography department. So there's a third phase in which Barnes opens his museum in 1927, but also present in this third phase is the exhibition that Locke helped organize of the Blondiau Theatre Arts Collection at the New Circle Art Gallery in Midtown Manhattan, that was run by the Austrian-born gallerist Gisrael Burr Newman, who also exhibited at New Art Circle Max Beckmann, Paul Klee, and Velizy Kandinsky. So I'll say a little bit about the genesis of this exhibition in 1927. Passing through Brussels the previous year in 1926, Locke noticed an impending auction of artifacts that had been collected by Raoul Blondiau, who was a former diplomat in the Belgian Congo. And Locke persuaded Edith Isaacs, who was the editor of Theatre Arts Monthly, and this was the journal in which Locke's 1922 article, Steps Towards the Negro Theatre, really marked his entree into cultural criticism. Locke persuaded Isaacs to put up funds for a bid, which she did, convinced that the Blondiau collection was not only worthy of exhibition in New York, but that it could also serve as the basis of a teaching collection from which American artists could learn about African art, which was, after all, the principal thrust of the legacy of the ancestral arts. So over 200 Bakuba and Bakongo works were exhibited from February to March 1927 at the New Art Circle, including the ceremonial cup that we saw Wells holding. And Locke was an important behind-the-scenes player in this exhibition that he co-curated with Sheldon Chaney, who was the former editor of Theatre Arts Monthly and the author of the 1924 book, A Primer in Modern Art. Just as, in his role at Howard, Locke had been an important player. He wrote to Wells in April of 1929, saying that, quote, one of the weaknesses of our own art department here at Howard is that it's in charge of a very academic person, Professor Joseph Herring, following which he wrote, quote, you should make out an application and send duplicate copies to President Mordecai Johnson, adding, I have no sympathy with all this routine, but I may be able to say a few strategic words in the right quarter. And he clearly did, because Wells became head of graphic arts at Howard when he joined the faculty later that year. So Edith Isaacs was repaid in full by funds that were raised at the Town Hall benefit recital that was held April 20th, 1927, in which Paul Robeson and Lawrence Brown performed a program of Negro folk music. So with patrons that included Alexander Bing, who was a New York property developer, and Walter Park, who was co-curator of the 1913 Armory Show, the International Modern Art exhibition that had introduced European modernism to American audiences, alongside other patrons that included the philanthropist George Foster Peabody and Charlotte Osgood Mason. And all of this speaks to Locke's role as a go-between, able to connect people, as he had done at the Civic Club dinner. His idea for the Harlem Museum of African Art was to provide a permanent home, an institution, for the Blondiau Theatre Arts Collection. And thanks to Ernestine Rose and Arthur Schomburg, the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library did just that for a while, making the collection publicly available to members of the public, including aspiring artists who might want to learn from aesthetic lessons imparted by classical African art. So the Harlem Museum of African Art went unrealized because the Carnegie Foundation declined to grant the $9,000 applied for in May of 1929. Well, that's the standard line in the literature, and money was indeed a factor. For as the Committee on African Art grew into the committee promoting the Harlem Museum of African Art, and then became the Harlem Citizens Committee for promoting a Harlem Institute of African Art and Culture, during this process, Locke penned letters appealing for $50 and $25 subscriptions. And he made the identity of his addressee clear when he wrote, quote, appeals to foundations cannot be honorably made until we have demonstrated our racial interest and loyalty to the idea of rescuing and revaluing our own past. To which he added, I'm a little embarrassed that so large a percentage of our funds to date have come from white friends of the movement, end quote. So just putting to one side the question of why it was that black patronage was more readily forthcoming for the literary arts, but not the visual, the difficulty with the standard line about Locke's failure to realize the Harlem Museum of African Art is that purely empirical methods of historical research cannot really satisfy our curiosity about the conjuncture, the contradictory conditions of the historical moment of the 1920s New York art world, where some possibilities were realized in the reception of African art, while other possibilities were blocked. Whenever such conditions of possibility, in Foucault's terms, are rendered unavailable by the discourses in which power and knowledge are articulated, we can, I suggest, reframe the story of the Harlem Museum of African Art not as a failure on Locke's part or on the part of the patrons who wanted to see it built, but as a story that reveals how the predominance of modernist primitivist discourse in the US reception of African art edged out the alternative paradigm that African American artists articulated in the name of diasporic ancestralism. So when tribal artifacts were violently uprooted from their original context by colonial trade routes that threw them into circulation in the West, it was not just that the intended meanings of the Bakuba cup that we started with, or a Fang reliquary figure, or a Dan mask, it's not just that their intended and original meanings were subject to erasure and loss, but that as they circulate, material objects acquired multiple meanings by virtue of moving and migrating across different interpretive contexts. What was plundered by soldiers for the cash value of ivory or bronze, what was demonized by missionaries as evidence of the paganism to be overcome by colonialism's civilizing mission, was decontextualized material that acquired semantic elasticity and an indeterminacy of meaning that when it was seized upon by French artists in 1905 was merely encoded within a third interpretive paradigm following that of the missionaries and the soldiers. Scholars and curators who are aware of the expropriation entailed by cross-cultural contact under colonial conditions rarely, it seems, act on the theoretical implications. To have one's property appropriated is to have something taken away or alienated from you, but to have it expropriated means that it cannot be taken back. The reparative impulse among scholars whose focal concern seems to be to restore African materials back into the original context for which they were intended is understandable. Yet even as such a reparative impulse seems to want to make amends for the violence of colonial decontextualization, the quest to restore a lost plenitude of meaning is not only illusory, but conservative. It's a problem because it fails to undo the authority that primitivism enjoys as the paradigm that discursively fixed the meaning of uprooted, culturally alien objects in formalist terms. So where the Harlem Museum of African Art instantiated a fourth paradigm, namely the ancestralism that Locke theorized in 1925, we cannot understand the closure point that compartmentalized African American modernists into a separate space from their Euro-American counterparts without first examining the discursive frontier that was being mobilized in the New York reception context of the late 1920s. And the frontier put into place more specifically on the grounds that the aesthetic valuation of tribal artifacts had come to be seen as completely incompatible with their ethnographic interpretation. So the curator of the Met's important 2012 exhibition acknowledged the fourth paradigm introduced by the Blondiot Theatre Arts Collection. But it would be misleading to assume that all four of these interpretive paradigms coexisted side by side. For the fate of the Harlem Museum of African Art reveals to us that not every interpretation won out, that the conjunctural conditions that made an uptown institution of bricks and mortar impossible in 1929 indicates a scene of asymmetrical entanglement, a balance of forces that Stuart Hall would describe as being structured in dominance, and a structure that in dominance that did not really get unraveled until the critique surrounding MoMA's 1984 primitivism show. which in the closing years of the century was really the last gasp of the formalist reading of African art installed by the discourse of modernist primitivism. So the fate of the Harlem Museum of African Art, far from being a marginal footnote, gets us to the heart of this agonistic entanglement. Once we reread the archive, not just for empirical facts, but for the competing interpretive discourses that attributed meaning to tribal artifacts that had become diasporized far from their origins. So I think it's important to continue with this backstory for a little bit to really get an appreciation of how integral Locke's role as a player was. In the first bronze booklet of 1936, Negro Art Past and Present, Locke mentions Felix von Lucian, a young curator who, acting without official orders, acquired an auction bargain that has turned out to be the most prized and valuable collection of African art in existence. Now, what Locke was referring to was the 1898 auction in London of art that had been captured by the British Army in its 1897 punitive expedition against the Oba of Benin. After the king closed his borders to foreigners in the palm oil trade, the British, who were competing with the French and Germans some 10 years after the 1885 scramble for Africa, punished the sovereign by razing his palace. And the cash value of the spolia was part of military calculations from the start. James Phillips, who was the envoy to Ralph Moore, the governor of Britain's Niger Coast Protectorate, wrote, quote, "I have reason to hope that sufficient ivory would be found in the king's house to pay for the expenses incurred in removing the king from his stool." Moore himself kept one item. This was the 17th century double-sided Ioba pendant mask portraying Queen Idea, mother of the Oba Esigi in the 17th century. And this was one half of a two-part work that he sold to the anthropologist Charles Seligman of London School of Economics, who owned it before Nelson Rockefeller purchased it in 1958 for the Met, with the other half having been accessioned into the British Museum prior to the 1898 auction. So I'll pick up on this backstory later, but the whole reason why Van Lucian mattered to Locke was because the act of transvaluation that he performed in his 1898 Altuma von Benin monograph. And this is where he argued that Africans had originated art of comparable aesthetic value to that of ancient Greeks. It was a living instantiation of the philosophical questions that Locke had examined through the lens of pragmatism. As his Oxford thesis, it was entitled The Category of Value, which was rejected in part on account of its value relativism, as that developed into his Harvard PhD, which is called The Problem of Classification in the Theory of Value, Locke's premise was that values are not intrinsic to objects or activities, but are the outcome of acts of valuation that take place under conditions that are susceptible to change. It was not just that Van Lucian relativized the imperial binary of superiority and inferiority, writing in 1898 that, quote, "there are no other savages in Africa than some whites acting crazily." But the important thing was that the transvaluation Locke witnessed firsthand during his Berlin study year also applied to the inner world of the new Negro. Where the third paragraph of the legacy essay states that, quote, "the American Negro, even when he confronts the various forms of African art expression with a sense of its ethnic claims upon him, meets them in as alienated and misunderstanding an attitude as the average European Westerner," end quote. What Locke wanted new Negro artists to perform was an act of self-transvaluation in which black American artists would lay claim to what was hitherto devalued and revalue it in light of African art's impact in altering European self-perceptions of Africa from the 1890s onward. Yes. I think I need to take this off. It's very hot.
That's because you're on fire, Kobe.
Oh, right. So I assume this is still recording then. Okay. So before we look at how artists such as James Lesesney Wells, Palmer Hayden, and Malvin Gray Johnson responded to Locke's call, we need to ask why Locke's double-sided view of uprooted artifacts as being both amenable to an aesthetic as well as ethnographic interpretation did not win out in the face of the asymmetrical institutional conditions of the 1920s New York art world. So the announcement card for Statuary in Wood by African Savages, The Roots of Modern Art, in 1914, proclaimed that it was the first time in the history of exhibitions that Negro statuary will be shown from the point of view of art, end quote. This was created by Marius Desire, and the exhibition was important because it was followed in December 1914 by Picasso and Braque, and then by Picabia in January 1915. So it really marks the full-blown embrace in the New York art world of modernist tendencies toward abstraction in European Cubism and Dada. So Edward Steichen photographed Ivory Coast Baule and Gouraud masks against sheets of colored paper. Quote, this is from his 1961 memoir, "I brought several reams of yellow, orange, and black sheets of paper. I took all the sculptures down and made an abstract geometric pattern on the walls," adding that, quote, "the whole room came alive, the colored papers serving like a background of jungle drums," end quote. And Steichen did something similar again in 1915 when paintings by Picasso were installed next to Kota reliquary figures. And Steichen also added a wasp's nest and filled a vase with dried flowers. As he had done in the 1914 exhibition previously, what he was doing was dramatizing a formalist way of seeing, a disposition in which looking at things in an abstractive, decontextualizing exhibition space brought out the purely formal, non-referential, non-mimetic qualities of autonomous works. As the curator Helen Shannon sharply observes, quote, "in the act of bringing these disparate objects together as equals, not just tribal masks, but also the vase of flowers and the wasp's nest, Steichen's photographs document not an exhibition, but an idea that form is the subject of modern art," end quote. So abstracting any object, even a wasp's nest, out of its conventional context, formalism conferred autonomy on objects that were put forward to be exhibited from the point of view of art. And it thereby prolonged the logic of extractive decontextualization. But what we also need to notice is that by the mid-1920s, such formalist codings of semantically elastic, culturally alien objects became ever more strident in asserting an exclusively aesthetic valuation of African materials over and against the anthropological valuation of similar bodies of material that were exhibited under the rules of the ethnographic exhibition. So for his part, if we have a look at the installation in the Barnes's Foundation, Barnes went against the grain when he paired Dan masks with their elongated and oval shapes with Modigliani portraits on the south wall of room 22 at the Barnes Foundation Museum. So for his part, while Barnes thought morphological similarities would encourage his museum visitors to broaden their appreciation of art as an occasion for aesthetic experience, by the late 1920s, these juxtapositions between modernist work and African art were becoming increasingly rare, as if too close a proximity might be interpreted as the modernist not just being influenced by the tribal, but of copying it in an act of derivation that would undermine the value of originality within modernist discourse. So the 1923 exhibitions happily juxtaposed small-scale sculptural figurines, this is the exhibition at the Whitney Studio Club at the top, with various tribal sources. And the installations shots we see highlight the sparseness by which autonomy was conferred on the objects by the amount of viewing space that they were given in a white cube display setting. This is a convention by the early 1930s, had become eventually installed as an institutional norm for the exhibition of modernist art. So for the Whitney, opening in 1930, and then MoMA, which was formed in 1929 and rented a brownstone and then the basement galleries of the Rockefeller Center before moving into its 53rd Street home in 1939, such white wall display conventions announced a formalist narrative. And when it came to the display of uprooted tribal artifacts, the discourse supporting such exhibitionary rules stridently sought to set themselves apart from the cluttered vitrines and display cabinets of the Ethnographic or Natural History Museum. So if we focus on those modes of display, we see that when Stuart Cullen curated primitive Negro art at Brooklyn Museum in 1923, which was in the second phase in the US reception of African art, he followed the example of the Pitt Rivers Museum, established at University of Oxford in the 1880s, that displayed items in very dense clustered, often arranged in symmetrical fashion based on classificatory categories. The horizontal stacking of blades that we see in this installation shot here, an exhibition of tools. The horizontal stacking of blades and agricultural tools in this installation shot repeated the serried ranks of material displayed in the Africa Hall of the American Museum of Natural History in 1910, with the cluttering being based on a taxonomic epistemology of what anthropologists knew about the uses, purposes, and intended meanings of the tribal object on show. And here it is that we get to the nub of things. So in his review of the exhibition, the Cleveland professor and Nation art critic Thomas Monroe entitled his review of Alain Locke's 1927 exhibition, Good and Bad Negro Art. As if the shrill tone of either-or judgmentalism were not enough of an indication of Monroe's position, his view that the collection serves, quote, deserves as a whole neither the word primitive, nor African, nor art, end quote, betrays the epistemological fault lines along which the closure between aesthetic and ethnographic paradigms had hardened by the time the Harlem Museum of African Art idea was launched. So for Monroe, who was the author of the Barnes Foundation's 1926 book, Primitive Negro Sculpture, which had Charles Sheeler's photographs, the exhibition that Locke and others had helped put together was not primitive because in his view, it showed, quote, debased modern examples that outnumbered, quote, a few surviving masterpieces. In his view, it was not African enough because syncretic elements, such as the Catholic iconography of Madonna and Child he detected in some pieces, meant it was not ethnically authentic. And thirdly, it was not art, in his view, because it included utensils and utilitarian objects from everyday life, as well as ritualistic marks and reliquary figures that form the basis of the Blondiau Theatre Arts collection, all being very different from the large-scale carved figures that were favored by European and American collectors, such as we see in Sheeler's photograph of Quinn's collection and also the Arsenberg apartment. One could perhaps concede that the variety of types of artifact that was shown by Locke in 1927, which included masks, fetish boxes, cups, bowls, decorative arts, directed attention to surface pattern rather than the volumetric heft, the kind of sculptural solidity, the three-dimensionality that is being dramatized in Sheeler's photograph by the dramatic shadows being conveyed from a low angle. And even the small carvings that we can see on the mantelpiece in the Arsenberg apartment, which is somewhat cluttered and unwhite cube-like, those figures have a sculpturalness that Monroe was looking for, that he wanted to see, but did not find in the 1927 Blondiau Theatre Arts collection. When Monroe stated that he had seen, quote, nothing much of artistic merit in the African collection at the New York Museum of Natural History, and went on to say he'd seen nothing of artistic merit in, quote, the British Museum, the Congo Museum at Brussels, the Trocadero at Paris, and the Folklore Museum of Germany, where, in his view, the works of art are far outnumbered by pieces of merely ethnological interest, his absolutism seems extraordinary. Instead of being able to acknowledge that ethnographic and aesthetic ways of seeing could coexist, Monroe saw one as the complete antithesis of the other. However, it only looks that way from our point of view, because we occupy a post-colonial episteme, because we know how James Clifford's art and culture system works, even though that has yet to be applied to decompartmentalizing the closer point that by the late 1920s had split primitivism off from ancestralism. So at a time when primitivist codings of cultural difference relied entirely on a categorical either-or logic of mutually exclusive binaries, tribal, modern, savage, civilized, self, and other, it's very important for us to notice that the conceptual motif that loomed larger in Alain's Locke thinking was a countervailing logic of doubleness, doubling, and double-facingness. So in notes preparatory to the 1927 exhibition, I'll go back to the catalogue pages from it. This is an unpublished essay in preparation for the exhibition. Locke pushed back against either-orism. Once we listened to him holding out for a double-sided balance between the aesthetic appreciation of plastic form and an ethnographic understanding of cultural meaning, we see that this even-handed balance comes across when he weighed matters up along the following lines. Quote, "There are few collections of African art that do not either sacrifice the scientific interest to the artistic or the artistic to the scientific. In the one case, cultural representativeness is lost in the attempt to pull out the objects of superior beauty and workmanship, and we get a mere exotic hodgepodge of unrelated samples, widely separated in type, period, and provenance. In the other, in the search for museum completeness, with no principle of artistic selection, this art is allowed to lapse back to the dead level of the ethnographic curiosity," end quote. So what Locke was doing in this unpublished paper was making the case for the synthesis that the Blondiau Theatre Arts Collection had achieved. And he performed a similar double move in the Legacy essay as well. Gladly incorporating formalist insights, in that essay, Locke quoted Roger Fry approvingly, agreeing that, quote, "African art has complete plastic freedom. That is to say," this is Roger Fry speaking, "that is to say, these Africans really can see form in 3 dimensions," end quote. While at the same time, in that 1925 essay, Locke held out hope that ethnographic knowledge about the material's indigenous meanings would gradually fill in the gaps of what anthropologists did not yet know about art in Africa. And as a case in point, in his 1925 contribution to the survey graphic, Melville Herskovits had argued that the American Negro had no distinctive cultural pattern. It was after his Georgia Sea Islands fieldwork that Herskovits changed his mind as he discovered Africanist survivals and retentions in spoken dialect, folk religion, and material culture. Although what we need to take notice of is that this was published in 1941, some 16 years after the Legacy essay written in 1925. So what I'm getting at is this double-facingness, this double-angled viewpoint that Locke mobilized in his thinking about African art. And he states this in the Legacy essay when in the following way. By playing off traditions of European art history and their representations of black subjects with the representations of blacks in American art. He writes, quote, "The Negro is a far more familiar in American life than European, but in American art, barring caricature and genre, reflects him scarcely at all," end quote. Whereas Europeans, as far back as the French Romanticists, have looked upon the African countenance and discovered there a beauty that calls for a distinctive idiom, both of colour and modelling, the upshot for Locke is that African American art had been held back by taking American art as its model. Even more so than the timid conventionalism that Locke decried, it was the absence of a distinctive school of American Negro art that his interventions, the 1925 essay, the 1927 exhibition, the 1928 museum proposal, all set out to remedy. There were successful 19th century individuals, such as Henry Asawa Tanner, Locke was quick to acknowledge, But because Tanner, Edmonia Lewis, and Robert Scott Duncanson mostly tended to shy away from black subjects, they left, in his view, black artists of the 1920s without, quote, the guidance of a distinctive tradition, end quote. So the manifesto-like declarations that we find in the 1925 essay, quote, any vital artistic expression of the Negro theme and subject in art must break through the stereotypes to a new style, a distinctive fresh technique, and some sort of characteristic idiom. And another line in which we hear, art must discover and reveal the beauty which prejudice and caricature have overlaid. All vital art opens our eyes to that which previously we could not see. These were far from lofty or abstract. Having diagnosed the problem by contrasting black representation in European art history as against American art, Locke's judgment about black artists of his own time, that the conformist academicism of a painter such as Laura Wheeler Waring and William Edward Scott was, quote, imitative and not highly original, was offset in turn by the praise he singled out for, quote, the work of young artists such as Archibald Motley, Otto Farrell, Albert Smith, John Urquhart, Samuel Blount, and especially that of Charles Keene and Aaron Douglas, end quote. So passing judgment in the court of culture was Locke's forte in his cultural criticism, whether it was art, literature, music, or theatre. But instead of judging for judging's sake, the strong evaluative distinctions he made were integral to his philosophy of culture as the means by which to build up a culture that was emerging from the old Negro's historical conditions of marginality and subordination. Judging on the basis of reasoned distinctions and stylistic differentiations is how you strengthen the relationship between tradition and the individual talent, in T.S. Eliot's terms, so as to therefore encourage the growth of new Negro modernism that Locke wanted to see. So again, we're focusing on the legacy of the ancestral arts essay, in which Locke is urging African-American artists to find their own voice by learning from European art, past and present, rather than American art history. And in this sense, his ancestralism posited a triangular flow between Africa, Europe, and America, rather than the Western, non-Western dichotomy assumed by primitivism. Now, some scholars hear alarm bells in Locke's claim that African art, quote, once known and appreciated, can scarcely have less influence upon the blood descendants bound to it by a direct sense of cultural kinship than upon those who inherit it by tradition and through the channels of an exotic curiosity and interest. As literary scholar Jean Jarrett points out, quote, Locke's utterance of both blood and cultural kinship in the same sentence straddled the fine line between biological and cultural constructions of race. But when the art historian Patricia Hills claims that Locke's inclination for planting his philosophical feet on both sides simultaneously amounts to a maddening penchant on the part of a thinker who wants to have it both ways, the converse argument, in my view, is that this both and logic of doubleness was a pragmatist's strategic refusal to make logocentric choices in either or terms. Urging 1920s artists to learn from both the arts of the forefathers, I'm quoting, the arts of the forefathers, the lesson of a classical background, the lesson of discipline, style, and technical control, and, quote, the lesson that contemporary European art has already learned, end quote, Locke foresaw a distinctively hyphenated modernism, an Afro-Modernism in which composite elements drawn cross-culturally from three inheritances, Africa, Europe, and America, announced a diasporic way of seeing, a diasporic mode of being in which American and Negro were not categorical either or opposites, but signifying elements entering into fresh combinatorial possibilities. So in reviewing the asymmetrical conditions of the US reception context, where ancestralism did not win out in the face of modernist primitivist discourse, we need to see doubleness in Locke's analytical reasoning as the counterpoint to the closure imposed by the dichotomous logic of either-orism. Many have seen Locke's investment in the tutelage of a classical art tradition as analogous to the revival of Greco-Roman antiquity in the Italian Renaissance, while others have interpreted a quest for a usable past along the lines that Van Wyck Brooks called for in American Literature in 1918. As Locke shifted his attention in his art writings of the 1930s from African art to the contribution of Negro folk culture, he did not actually follow up on how artists of the 1920s engaged with African artifacts, even though the Blondiau Theatre Arts collection was an indispensable resource for many. And as we think about artists of the 20s and 30s who engaged with African materials, I'm offering my own reading when I start from the question, why was it that still life was the genre of choice in which artists of the 20s and 30s engaged with tribal artifacts? Bearing in mind, however, at the same time that it's vital for us to pay attention to the editorial care that Locke took in framing the very first publication of County Cullen's Heritage in the pages of the 1925 survey graphic number. For just as we saw layout as a platform for argumentation in its own right in the 1924 Opportunity number, the meticulous care with which 4 photo reproductions frame the question that Cullen's poem is asking draws attention to the question of whether a diaspora's past is retrievable or representable as such. Arthur Schomburg had been unequivocal in The Negro Digs Up His Past when he declared, quote, "The American Negro must remake his past in order to make his future," and that, quote, "history must restore what slavery took away, for it's the social damage of slavery that the present generation must repair," end quote. But such a reparative and restorative model implies that the past is waiting to be retrieved, that the past may have gone missing, but that it nonetheless can be made present. Whereas Cullen was asking whether a stolen legacy, a legacy in which one inherits an absence of ruins, to quote from another corner of the diaspora, means that one confronts instead absence, loss, a kind of diaspora-shaped hole in the diasporic soul. So as the first stanza reads, 3 centuries removed from the scenes his father loved, spicy grove and banyan tree, what is Africa to me? The question we need to notice is not a prompt for problem solving, but a riddle arising from an encounter with something enigmatic and opaque. Cullen had no first-hand experience of Africa, and like all those thrown into the condition of diaspora by the forced migration of the Middle Passage, he faced someone else's descriptions and depictions of Africa in the new Negro moment of potential self-transvaluation. And it's precisely Africa in quotation marks, Africa as someone else's representational construct, that Cullen addresses in the second stanza, quote, "Africa, a book one thumbs, listlessly till slumber comes." And what we see here is the poet wrestling with primitivist imagery of jungles, rivers, blood, and drums, imagery in which he can, quote, "find no peace, no slight release." The dilemma the poem addresses within the framework of diasporic ancestralism, the dilemma of a seemingly self-divided subject whose Christian faith, acquired over centuries in the West, is actually at odds with the pantheistic Bushongo and Zue Numia carvings that we see in the photographs. We can think of this dilemma as a literary inscription of the problem space that visual artists were addressing by approaching uprooted tribal African artifacts through strategies of indirection and double voicing within the still life. So earlier, I cast doubts on Wendy Grossman's view that Alain's portrait of Wells holding the Bakuba Cup was a scene of empowerment, although it is to Grossman that we owe the archival recovery of photographic studies in the Blondiau Theatre Arts collection by Marjorie Griffith, who is the sister of William E. Harmon's wife. Griffiths was asked by the Harmon Foundation administrator, Mary Beatty Brady, to produce study aids to circulate to schools and colleges in lieu of the actual objects themselves. And Griffiths' photographs of the 2 exquisitely carved Bapide combs on your left, showing the artifacts propped against a support to show their 3 dimensions, really offers the photograph as a factual report on the objects, straightforwardly documenting what the eye would see. However, it's impossible, when we look at the photograph on the right, not to notice the urge to comment that comes in the photo, her photo of a Bayaka carving that's propped up against two library books that are entitled 7 Years in South Africa. You can just about make that out on the spine of the book. This supplement renders the photographic document with drapes on the left-hand side and the carving shadow on the right into a tabletop still life tableau. But I think something even more compelling comes into view when we take into account the frequency with which black artists turn to the still life genre to frame African artifacts. Still life was a staple of academic art training, yet there is a doubling brought about whenever African-American artists infuse their still life renderings of African object d'art with an ambivalent structure of feeling that's fully in keeping with the self-questioning tenor of Cullen's poem. So with the Harman Foundation acting as the principal institutional patron of black visual arts with their annual art exhibitions from 1926 to 1935, Mary Beattie Brady relied on Locke's judgment, even though her emphasis as a gatekeeper who regulated black access to exhibition opportunities was for artists to demonstrate their competence in producing verisimilitude. In other words, Brady was a figure who aimed to steer Harlem Renaissance artists of the 20s and 30s far away from both modernism and ancestralism alike. As David Driscoll points out, and Driscoll had first-hand experience of the foundation, quote, Brady did not feel comfortable with Locke's emphasis on the African heritage in the art of the Negro, and Brady did not want to see black artists move further away from the mainstream of American art. So on the one hand, when we think about work such as Palmer Hayden's Fétiche et Fleur of 1932, or Frank Dillon Joseph's Still Life of 1933, and Malvin Johnson's Negro Heads, which I'll come on to in a moment, we can see that they attempted to satisfy such conformist demands by placing African art into tabletop settings as merely one observable object amongst others. Yet in Wells's block print, Hieratic Heads, circa 1930, there is a challenge to instant legibility that indicates that something more than an academic exercise is taking place beneath the surface. Between the decorated bowl in the lower left foreground, make it out here. Between the decorated bowl in the lower left foreground and the circular shape in the rear, it's unclear whether the forms that we see in the middle ground are three living faces or three inert masks. The figure ground ambiguity, in other words, that makes the print impossible to decipher in a single glance, alerts us to an act of double inscription in which, behind the routine academic exercise, questions of immense philosophical gravitas of the kind being asked by County Cullen were being reiterated by visual artists as well. The diminutive African figurine in this print by Wilma Jennings, which is in the Met, is really camouflaged by darting lines that the printmaker has etched onto the plate. What results are figure ground ambiguities similar to Wells's Hieratic Heads. And to the right of Jennings's African figurine stands a Sansevieria plant with its chevron-like patterned leaves echoing the folds of fabric. But on the left, on this side, I always get left and right mixed up, on this side is a funeral urn. Such a pairing of living plant and the ashes and dust by which the funeral urn signifies death underlines the gravitas of something being voiced beneath the still life's banal genre conventions, something being signified by indirection because it is of such awesome importance as to be too big, too much to apprehend directly. What each of these two still lives by Jennings and Wells are addressing, I suggest, is the historical experience of absence, lost, and the uprooting, the rupture of ancestral continuity by which the Afro-diaspora subject was brought into being across the Middle Passage. Stylistically, Cullen was no modernist, but addressing Africa as unreachable except as a representational construct, he operated on shared terrain with Jennings and Wells, for whom the African object d'art presides over a scene in which the subjective correlative to the absence, loss, and rupture of ancestral continuity is the affective state of mourning. When we fail to notice what works are actually showing us, the most misleading aspect of the reclaim your roots approach that misreads ancestralism as a homecoming scene in which diasporic orphans are reunited with the motherland, so to speak, is the unrealistic presumption that the new Negro's affirmative identification with all things African arose ex nihilo, out of nothing, as if it were a tabula rasa. A viewpoint that completely misrecognizes the necessity of mourning the death of the old as a vital precondition for the birth of the new. To enter into the pensive, moody, introspective structure of feeling, whereby ancestralist still life prints and paintings reveal an ambivalent relationship to African masks along the lines of a subject-to-subject dialogue, rather than primitivism's brash subject-object dichotomies, is to situate Malvin Johnson's self-portrait of 1934, a painting in which the artist quotes his Negro masks of 1932, which is based on a Gelede helmet mask from Nigeria at left. Oops. That one. And a Bois mask from the Congo, both of which sit atop a Bakuba textile. And all three items came from the Blondiau Theatre Arts collection that Locke helped to put together. But I want to focus on Malvin's self-portrait really as the masterpiece of diasporic ancestralism, whose significance, I think, has so far eluded the art historical record. So in the portrait, Johnson's eye line is the most important feature of the work. The upward angle at which the artist looks out to us as viewers suggests that a mirror that was tipped slightly forward was used in the production of the painting, and a mirror would also account for the reversed relationship of the Bois and Gelede masks in the picture within a picture behind Johnson's head and shoulders. We can see that they've reversed. The contiguity, placing the artist's head on a shared plane with the African masks, articulates an iconographic chain of similarities and differences. Head, mask, object, image all have similar shapes, but each belongs to entirely different ontological registers. Ambivalence is compounded as we behold the indecipherable expression on Johnson's face. Are we seeing a black self that has been mirrored by his alter ego, represented by the two tribal masks? Or, instead of a two-part relationship, are we in the midst of a three-part inquiry in which we, as viewers, are the very subject that Johnson, whose face is aligned with the mask, the very subject that Johnson is addressing with his unflinching gaze? Reading his facial expression as insistently asking something, what is my relationship with these artifacts? What is their relationship with me? What is your relationship with me? The searing vulnerability that we see inscribed on the artist's face is telling us that Malvin was already aware that the kinds of questions he was asking may well be unanswerable, just as County Cullen's opaque and enigmatic riddle, or just like County Cullen's opaque and enigmatic riddle. So were we to take on Freud's definition of identification as, quote, the earliest expression of an emotional attachment to another person, end quote, we see that the mask acts as a metonymic signifier of lost Mother Africa, as it presides over a scene in which an attachment to an unretrievable past before the break, in the psychic state Freud describes as melancholia, has now given way to mourning, a letting go that is never an abandonment of the past, but the incorporation of what is lost into memory and narrative. And it's this process of mourning that enables the survivor to move forward into a future of their own choosing. The tribal objects figured in the still life paintings and prints by which Afro-modern artists created diasporic ancestralism matter not because they guarantee an upbeat identification, but because they signify the life-affirming work of mourning, the Trauerarbeit that was operative in the sorrow songs, or the Trauerspiel in the aural realm. Far from being morbid, the transformation from a melancholy attachment to what is gone, to the mourning that readies the survivor to move forward into the future, is life-affirming because it involves the digestion of loss. It is this Trauerarbeit, or mourning work, that digests the absence, the loss, and that then incorporates the ancestral talisman into an act of identification that displaces someone else's idea of Africa, to which the old Negro had been subjected. And it's this mournful process taking place beneath the surface of the tabletop still life that describes how new Negro identity was born. So the Fang reliquary figure in Palmer Hayden's Fétiche et Fleurs, placed on a table within a fashionably appointed apartment, seems incongruous at first glance. After all, reliquary figures come from funeral rites. Yet, as an object in the midst of other objects, the Fang artifact seems to be no more significant than the vase of orchids or the cigarette in the ashtray. But to the extent that the African artifact, whether a reliquary figure, a carved statuette, or a mask, to the extent to which the artifact is a metonym for the diaspora's lost origins, it signifies analogously to the skull that is traditionally placed in still life vanitas paintings in European art as both an observable object but also as a symbol of death. The skull that we see in this Dutch example from 1642 revels in the painter's bravura skills in verisimilitude. It offers us visual pleasure in the lifelike rendering of sensuous surfaces, even though, as a memento mori, the skull is there to remind us of death's omnipresence, all the more so to enjoy life's transient pleasures in the here and now. So one might say that long after death was sanitized in industrial modernity, making it something to fear by banishing it from visibility, Afro-diasporic cultures persisted with a public practice of grief and mourning work. In caring for the dead so openly, so lavishly, and often quite theatrically, what we see in James Van der Zee's mortuary portrait, this is an example of 1944, is an excess or too muchness that reveals a will to aestheticize that fully understands that however many flowers we place on the wreath, too much will never be enough to stand in for the one who is absent, the one who is gone, the one who is no longer with us. So practices such as this in the mortuary photograph already contain a theory of representation, a theory that knows that what is gone, what is lost, can never be brought back again, that what is absent cannot be made present in acts of depiction or description, that will always be inadequate to the reality of loss. So in Shakespeare's play, Hamlet had been immobilized in melancholia. But when Metawarrick Fuller chose the particular moment in the play when Hamlet addresses Yorick's skull, this is the moment when the melancholy prince acknowledges that we all must returneth to dust. This choice on the part of Fuller is all important. And as we switch from the European master text to the ancestralist subtext inscribed by Afro-modern doubling in Talking Skull, the sculpture of 1938, we see that Fuller is pinpointing the moment of acknowledgement of loss in acts of mourning that enable Hamlet to move out of his melancholic attachment to his deceased father. Fuller has chosen the exact moment in Talking Skull, the exact moment when, through grief work, the bereaved converts an emotional attachment into a memorial process of incorporative identification, which is what allows the subject to move forward into future-oriented action. So in place of the reclaim your roots cliché, which assumes the past is a positive datum capable of being retrieved in representation, the whole reason why ancestralism is foundational to African American modernism as it emerges in the 1920s is precisely because the ancestor is unknown and unnameable, because the past has been stolen. The violent theft of Benin art in 1897 intensified millions of times over in the Middle Passage. What makes Fuller, Johnson, Jennings and Wells modernists as I've been describing them, is an understanding of absence and loss as realities that bring one up against the limits of representation. For it's precisely the conventions that delimit what is representable in black life that have given rise to the artist's ingenious tactics of indirection, of hiding, and of doubling that are among the differential signifying strategies that Afro-modernists contributed to 20th century art as a whole. So the brochure text for the 1927 Blondiau Theatre Arts exhibition was unattributed, but the voice is unmistakably Locke's. They speak in his unique idiom. Africa's art creed was beauty in use. No tool of daily living was too small or too unimportant to be made without grace and without imagination. If primitive folk can lavish such beauty on almost every conceivable article of daily use, should we be content to let the ugliness of the machine crowd beauty out of our civilization into the narrow corner of the fine arts? And I like the fact that we have an exclamation mark rather than a question mark. So Locke precisely envisioned the Harlem Museum of African Art along such lines as a democratically accessible institution that would make a teaching collection available to the public at large. But he found that there was no room for his Janus-like cross-cultural model that looked both ways in a habitus where art increasingly cut itself off into a high culture sphere antithetical to the culture of the popular masses. Locke's museum was certainly not thwarted by one single review, but in the struggle amongst discursive paradigms of primitivism and ancestralism, each striving to win support for the preferred meanings they assigned to uprooted materials, Locke's ancestralist discourse did not prevail under the asymmetrical conditions of American modernism in the New York art world of the 1920s. Even so, when we know how to look, we're forcefully reminded of Freud's insight that what is repressed often returns through the very same discourse that is doing the repressing. This is my case in point. With 603 objects from 15 museum collections and 50 private owners, Museum of Modern Art James Johnson Sweeney won praise for his 1935 survey exhibition, African Negro Art. The art historian Robert Goldwater backed up the formalist point of view put forward in the exhibition. And Locke, too, praised Sweeney for confirming, quote, the existence of a grand style with corresponding heroic proportion and simplicity. This is from his essay, Classical African Art. And indeed, under Alfred Barr Jr.'s directorship, MoMA had been fully committed to outreach. The 1935 exhibition was part of a 10-year cycle exhibiting pre-modern art from around the world, from the ancient Aztecs to native North Americans, a cycle that Barr initiated in 1933. And Sweeney's 1935 exhibition also led to a portfolio of photographs by Walker Evans that was commissioned by Goldwater as a study aid. So this portfolio was intended to facilitate studies in African art. Some of the portfolios were purchased by institutions such as the Trocadero in Paris, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, whereas MoMA and the General Education Board decided that 17 would be donated freely to historically black colleges. So we have a situation in which while the actual African art toured several US art museums, poster-sized photographs of the artifacts mounted on movable frames were shown in a separate exhibit that was entitled Photographs of African Negro Art by Walker Evans that traveled to 16 historically black colleges and universities, Tuskegee, Hampton, Atlanta, Howard and Lincoln amongst them. So photography made tribal art accessible, yet the two-tiered system of its dissemination made it all too clear who owned the overall narrative that would determine its meaning in the American context. Indeed, when MoMA circulated portfolios of African art in a teaching collection format, whose express purpose was to encourage wider study among the public at large, the museum revealed itself to be a mimic, copying the Harlem Museum of African Art idea that Locke had come up with several years earlier. So the story, of course, does not end there, but as we've seen, the reason why the paradigm of diasporic essentialism did not win out was because it was pushed aside by the discursive formation of modernist primitivism, that encourage institutions to adopt a formalist way of seeing, a way of seeing that assumed that aesthetic and ethnographic interpretations of African art were mutually exclusive. Bringing out the deep subtext of still life artworks from the 20s and 30s through a psychoanalytically inflected interpretation of mourning as a life-affirming rite of passage on the part of the new Negro, who made claims on modernism and modernity by acknowledging the death of the old, I've added an interpretation of artworks that employed materials from the Blondiau Theatre Arts collection to a contextual account of the institutional factors surrounding Locke's multifaceted uptake of African art. So tomorrow I'll move ahead to Locke's art writings of the 1940s, but to conclude for now, when we reinsert the interpretive framework that Locke named as ancestralism into our understanding of how uprooted material served as a catalyst for the birth of 20th century modernism, we find that received narratives that focus one-sidedly only on the primitivist paradigm are incomplete. And in the initial moves that I've made today to decompartmentalize the study of ancestralism, we've also come to see that the birth of modernism as a cross-cultural phenomenon coincided entirely with the birth of the new Negro subject itself.
That was fabulous. I'm late for a haircut. I just texted my barber, and then I'm joining you for dinner. But I would like for you to consider, well, first of all, it's a brilliant lecture. I lecture about the new Negro. I've edited a volume about the new Negro. Probably the first text in Black Studies I ever read was the new Negro, the survey graphic in the anthology in a class on the Harlem Renaissance in 1969. So I live with this, and I learned a lot. It made me think about things that I hadn't thought about. I would suggest a couple things, and then we'll pick this up at dinner. Then I'll turn it over to Carrie. If you would host, that would be great. And when you see me at dinner, I'll be all refreshed with my new haircut, right? One, the perfect epigraph is Locke's, and I was waiting for you to use it. Locke was saying to these young Negro artists, by being African, you are being modern. And I'll never forget that quote. And the reason is there was a revulsion. I would add revulsion to Mourning. There was an American Negro revulsion to Africa. In the new Negro movement was very complicated. And the relation of the American Negro to Africa is enormously complicated. If you think, oh, well, what about Marcus Garvey? Marcus Garvey was a big imperialist. He could care less about the Africans who were left back in Africa, and the African Americans were going to go back like they did in Liberia and just sweep these people away. And, you know, because the American Negro was the vanguard, keyword from the Harlem Renaissance, of the Negro peoples. And Locke used that word vanguard. Locke has two foes in the new Negro. One is the slow-moving masses. Because remember, the Great Migration really starts in 1890, but Harlem is still white in 1920. It's black by 1930, right? So this is all part of this larger thing. And in his essay in The New Negro, he represents the new Negro intellectuals, this upper middle aesthetic class, as a go-between, a bridge between the aristocratic white people, or the upper middle class white people, and the slow-moving Negro masses. And he uses that phrase, and there are 3 or 4 phrases for the migrants that he uses. But they weren't crazy, black people weren't crazy about Africa either. And this is all part of, I mean, in general, it's a big exception with Garvey, but even the Garvey movement is very, very complicated. And he's, in a way, trying to seduce them. You know, I'm going to give you a copy of mine. Maria Tartar and I just added to the Annotated African American Folktales. And I spent a lot of time looking at American Negro debates about Negro folklore, right? And whether it should be thrown in the garbage bin of history or preserved starting in the late 1880s and the early 1890s. And it led to, Anna Julia Cooper turned out to be pivotal in winning this argument, along with a guy from Harvard who was the president of the American Folklore Society. But there were a lot of black people who were just embarrassed about Brer Rabbit, Brer Bear, and wanted to see it disappear. So this argument about Negro folklore, and it ties into his lecture, which really goes on through the Harlem Renaissance. And when you said, Melville Herskovitz is notable for saying these American Negroes had nothing to do with African Negroes. There was, black Americans got their pictures of Africa from Tarzan novels and films like everybody else did. And it took a big leap. And Locke is arguing that these people, that if Africa could be retrieved by the modernists, specifically Picasso and, et cetera, and specifically Les Damoiselles, then if they can do it, we could do it even better. But that's the same argument that was used about Negro folklore because of Joel Chandler Harris. The reason we know about Brer Rabbit and Brer Bear is because of this white guy, translated it, quote unquote, reappropriated it, use whatever word that you want, published it in the Atlantic, became a millionaire, and then black people were saying, you can't be embarrassed about it. We can become millionaires too, or we can preserve it. And that specifically was written about by Charles Chestnut in his journal. That I can do, if Joel Chandler Harris could do it, I could do it even better. And then he started writing in the Atlantic, and he published the Conjure Tales. So there is this big black American debate is about whether the American Negro was better off by not being African. And what they argued in a crazy way, and I write about this, is that a 6-week or 2-month horrible nightmare boat trip, the Middle Passage, completely wiped out people's culture. And E. Franklin Frazier argued that. Lots of people, Robert Park and that school of sociology, they argued that. And it's a crazy idea. And of course, for those of us who are diasporic, we don't believe that. But the final thing I'll say, and then we'll pick this all up at dinner, is that not one time that I know of, and I want you to show, you can show me on your iPhone at dinner, one time that, and I use these terms, I think it's important to historicize the terms that black people call themselves, which is why I use them. But I'm, of course, an African American. I don't want anybody to be confused. Is as a structuring principle, as a new way of seeing. Even in the examples you gave, I didn't see one time where a black American artist is refiguring the way we represent the human form in the way that Picasso does with Les Damoiselles, and there's a zillion other examples from Cubism and Modernism. It's decorative. Cowrie shells. If you go back to that first image of Aaron Douglas, he's a classic example. People looking up and the new Negro. He even did a piece called The New Negro, and it's like this blithe figure in a dance thing with some palm trees and stuff all around. They never resaw the human form, reshaped the way you represent the human form through African eyes, as it were. However, I should probably put that, in the way that Picasso did with Les Damoiselles. I can't think of one example. It remains, even the brilliant reading that you did of, what's his name's self-portrait.
Malvin Johnson.
Yes. Yeah. Even that, he looks like he did. It's a realistic portrayal of himself in a mirror with reversed images, but not like the figures of Les Damoiselles. And that's what I have been lecturing about and puzzling about for a long, long time. So it's that the new and new Negro was anti-Southern slave migrant and also anti-African in a curious way. And they sneaked up on Africa through modernism. And Locke is very conscious of arguing that. So I wanted, because I'm getting old, I forget. So I wanted to throw this out and we can argue about it at dinner.
Okay.
Yeah, no, you're the host. Great.
Oh, great, okay.
And just say you agree with me 100%.
We all totally agree.
See you guys, see those of us at dinner. And see you all tomorrow. Come back, spread the word.
I don't think we need any hosting. Do you want to can you just answer?
Sure,
Would you
sure.
be willing to answer some questions? But we do need people to have the microphone when they ask questions.
I have a mic.
I guess I just have a question about some of your philosophical ideas. You kept saying ex nihilo, how I guess, I guess African Americans, well, the way I was interpreting it, this is the way Professor Gates was saying it, that African Americans kind of have this culture that comes out of nothing, but you kept talking about environmentalism and all this other sort of things. But I have a question. I'm going to actually read what I wrote because I'm sounding really crazy right now. Why is it important for African Americans who have been adulterated by our environment to have a trans-evaluation, rediscovery of primitive African art when there's already been a lot of appreciation for the substance of African art by way of Europe?
Sorry, can you repeat? I didn't get
Why is it important for African Americans who have been adulterated by our environment
Right.
to have I think you use this term, trans-valuation or trans-evaluation or something like that, rediscovery of primitive African art when there's already been enough appreciation within a lot of appreciation for the substance of African art by way of Europe? Does that make sense?
Yes. It's a bit challenging in light of the other view that's just been put forward as well.
Yeah, that's right.
But what Picasso and European modernists took from African art was coming from an agenda that was very different in terms of those who hadn't been nurtured by a tradition. Locke's whole point was that, yes, Tanner, Lewis, Duncanson were successful 19th century artists, but there's only a handful of works that portrayed black subjects. The self-transvaluation that takes place in the 1920s is that this is the first generation who wholeheartedly embrace blackness as their primary subject. And as Professor Gates was just saying, it was a struggle. It was somebody else's view of Africa that had been internalized over 3 centuries removed, to quote from the poem again. So that interest in how an artifact that's been taken from its origins had different meanings applied to it. It meant one thing to missionaries, one thing to soldiers, and another thing to avant-garde artists in Paris, was what Locke was focusing on in terms of encouraging artists precisely to get to that appreciation of Africanness that you're describing.
Is it possible for something to come out of nothing if you're in your environment? You just kept saying, come out of nothing, the nihilism out of nothing.
No, Locke didn't think that was possible. His argument was that culture is combinatorial. It's made out of a composite. It's like a mosaic. It's made up of multiple elements. What is important is reconfiguring them. And his focus on axiology, the theory of values, was all about the value isn't something that's encoded for all time by the Bakuba makers of those artifacts. Once the material was uprooted and taken away from them, it meant something different to European modernists. And he was urging African American artists who were, in a sense, orphaned, that they didn't have a solid tradition of black self-representation behind them, to draw both from what he felt was their biological inheritance, as well as to learn from the examples of what European modernists were doing, even though the modernists had a very different agenda, because for the most part, they'd subtracted out the ethnographic or the cultural meaning associated with these artifacts, and were looking at them purely in formal terms.
Okay. So, is this all right? Can you hear me? Is this right? Okay, great. Well, I hate to double Skip's act, but I want to be able to just offer my praise and a question, despite having to run. I wanted to be able to stay, because this, I think, has just been an exquisite presentation. Just magnificent on a number of levels, and I'll speak with you more about them later, and we'll introduce you tomorrow, so I'll have a chance to foreground and frame some of my comments. But my one kind of offering and one question. I was, again, as Skip mentioned, I was waiting for something too that was embedded in your talk, and it was a way in which there was a rhyme between Gordon Parks's quite masterful composition there with the Alain Locke portrait, gazing upon, as you say, the Richmond Barthe, not object but subject, right? And I wondered if there was not a rhyme between the composition of that work and the Malvin Johnson self-portrait, right? That might be able to kind of come to the fore here. But finally, I wondered if you might speak to the analytical attention to, as you put it, to cross-cultural interaction that Locke is arguing is requisite here. As you consider the doubling that occurs between the survey graphic version of the New Negro and the New Negro anthology, the editorial decisions, the decision to, for example, leave out the Wynald Rees kind of telos from Congo, a familiar of our studios, to the college lad, and what this might say about his perhaps revision. As Carrie beautifully noted, you revise your own theses, and here Locke does as well. I wonder if you might just maybe nod to the revisions that he makes from survey graphic to the official document that we know of today. But thank you for just an extraordinary talk.
Thanks. No, it's a fascinating relationship in the sense that it's a two-part dialogue, I think, between Paul Kelleg, who is the editor of Survey Graphic, and Survey Graphic is coming out of a kind of liberal progressivism. Charities and Commons was the name of the social reform journal that Kellogg organized before. Survey Graphic was introduced with more visual material in an attempt to appeal to a wider audience. So you have Wynald Rice contributing to the Mexico edition, I think that was 1916 or so. And I see that in the context of Locke collaborating, working together, his role as a go-between in terms of facilitating alliances to produce the survey graphic. But following it up in terms of how that gets revised in the anthology with the elimination of Rice's portrait is, it would be definitely an avenue to pursue. I mean, here I was asking myself, well, Locke didn't pay attention to those artworks that did actually engage material that he made available through the Theatre Arts collection, which was the last body, including Malvin's self-portrait. And I was kind of wondering, well, how would that work read from a Lockean point of view, from the point of view of that interest in doubling and in resisting the idea that you have to approach things in an either-or mentality, which was what was so definitive of primitivism.
Yeah, if I could just add, of course, there was the response to that work, the firestorm controversy that it created might be of interest here to the Wynald Rees work. But thank you so much. Do you want me to give this?
I've been told we have to wrap things up for today. So I hope that everybody who still has questions, I know there are a lot, can come tomorrow when Professor Mercer will continue his study for us, and I'm sure we'll have time to ask lots of questions then. So sorry about that, and thank you.